Hello, I'm Shad. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Does suspension confuse the shit out of you? I know it used to with me for years, and only recently have I really just figured it out, and now that I have this new full suspension bike, I have played around with it and really have a solid understanding what all of the principles are. So I'm just going to go over what I've learned with you, and hopefully I can make it a little simpler for the rest of you. If you've been watching my YouTube channel, you know that I just got this new bike called the Heller Berghest. And last time I talked about my bike, I didn't know how to pronounce the name. But I went online and researched, and apparently a Berghest is some kind of mythical dog or something like that. Look it up if you're curious. So we're here to talk about suspension. I got 140 millimeters up front, 130 in the rear, and it's really hard to really know what suspension does versus just, you know, make your ride a little smoother. But there's a lot of principles going on that a lot of us may not understand. So I'm going to try to explain them as best as I can. The first thing we're going to talk about is compression. Compression is the amount of force it takes to actually push down on your fork. So you can think of force as weight or something like that. Like how much force is needed to actually make the fork compress. And there's an adjustment on my fork, and most mid-range or higher end forks will have an adjustment that changes compression. So compression, when I have the fork fully locked out, let me see which way this is. That's open. This is locked out. When it's fully locked out, it's really hard to push down. I mean, I could get it if I really jumped on there. This is good for climbing. As I open this up, I can easily push the fork down. So that's compression, how much force is needed to push down the fork. Same applies for a rear shock. I'm just going to talk about the fork because in the video it's much easier to show. But compression on the rear shock is the same. How much force is it needed to cause that shock to compress and do its thing. Now let's talk about rebound. Rebound is very different than compression. Rebound is how quickly does the fork return, or how quickly does it spring back at you. So there is an adjustment on this fork for rebound, and some forks have it. What it is it's this dial down here, and basically you can turn it and make the fork rebound really slow, or you can put it in the other adjustment and it'll rebound super quick. So right now I have the rebound set to quick, so it's going to come back right away. So when I push it down, it just springs right back. So I'm just pushing down and then letting go, and you can see how quickly it comes back up. And I'm not sure if you're going to notice the difference in the video, but I'll go ahead and open this thing up. So now when I push, it's going to come back much slower. Yeah, it was pretty obvious, I think. I'm not sure if you'll notice in the video, but when I push down, it actually comes back up slowly versus the first time when I was pushing down, it just sprang back up right away. That's rebound. And basically, you want your rebound set so it's not too slow, and you don't want it set too quick, because if you have it set too slow, what will happen is your fork will actually be compressed and still compressed when you hit the next bump, which means you won't have any suspension left. And basically suspension is your travel. Every fork has a little bit of different travel. In this case it's 140. If you have 100, let's just say you had 100 millimeters of travel, you hit a bump, and then when that was fully compressed, you used up almost all of your travel. You only had 20 millimeters, and then your rebound was so slow that you hit another bump and you only had that 20 millimeters, and so then it bottoms out. And you don't want that. So you want it to be quick enough so your wheel will, you know, be able to absorb that next hit. But you don't want it so fast that it feels springy, or that you basically, what will happen is if you have your rebound set super fast, is you'll still feel the bump. You'll just get the delay because you're going to hit the bump, it's going to compress, and it's going to spring back at you. So you kind of want your rebound set so you have a smooth ride, and you go through the bumps and your front end isn't springing up and down, or having it too slow, it's not getting any sudden jars like that. So that's something you have to play around with and set. I have mine somewhere in the middle. Once I get it set, I generally leave it alone. Now we're going to talk about damping. Now damping is one of those things that's rarely adjustable on your fork unless you have an extremely high-end fork. Damping is basically how quickly the fork stabilizes. I mean, I guess that's the best way I can describe it. So when your fork hits a bump and then it comes back out to its full extension, does it go bob, 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 or bounce a little bit? That's damping. So the best way I can describe it is, think of a car, and maybe you've seen one that has worn out struts or is missing the struts, and if it goes over a bump, the car will just keep bouncing. It'll just continuously bounce up and down, and then it won't stop and stabilize. So what that means is that the struts are worn out, or they're not doing their job. Same thing with a mountain bike fork. If you find that it has that kind of funny feel to it, then generally it means you need to get some parts replaced, or have your fork rebuilt, or buy a new fork depending on, you know, budget and where you're at, and solve that problem. Stiction is another thing you hear. It's not just a buzzword. It generally means friction with your fork. And I actually like the word stiction because it's kind of like the combination of stick and friction. So if you feel your fork sticking, like instead of it having smooth operation going up and down, if it feels like you push it down and it kind of doesn't come up very smoothly, even though you have your rebound set high, something like that, that means what's happening is in here you have friction going on, and a lot of times it's older lube, something like that, or you know, a lot of lower end forks just have stiction in general because they don't have very good quality stanchions and things like that. Seals can get worn and cause it, and there's lots of reasons for it, and generally the way to get rid of that is to have your fork rebuilt, and a lot of shops can, you know, make your fork feel smooth again. So that covers the different suspension properties. What I want to talk about now is just basically settings. So on my rear shock I have this air valve, and there's a manual for the shock that tells me how much air I should put in here, and sometimes they have a guide as to how much should you put in for a rider weight, which, you know, at least gets you in the ballpark. But really what you want to do is, in this case, you can see I have this rubber ring. Make sure my shock is set in the full open setting. In this case I have 5 settings here, so that would be the downhill setting. Downhill is generally going to be the full open setting. If I have it set in the climbing setting, it's going to be much stiffer, so I want it in the full open setting. And then I want to get on the bike, and then when I get on the bike, you're going to see the shock compress. And when the shock compresses, I'm just going to do it by hand, it'll move this ring down to wherever it compressed to. And basically you want that to come down to about 25%. And that should be about the right amount of compression. So you'll want to adjust your air So that happens about 25%. Forks, sometimes they can be a little complicated or super simple to operate. Lower end forks usually will just have a simple compression setting. As you get into the mid-range, they'll have the compression and then the rebound like I showed you down at the bottom. And then in this case I have an air valve right here, and I can put air in here. Again, I want to open this up to its full open position and put just the right amount of air in here for this fork to compress roughly about 25%. So there you have it. I made it as simple as I could, or as simple as I know how, being that I am relatively new at the whole suspension game. If you don't really want to mess around with this stuff, I suggest going to a shop and having them set it up for you. But if you ride a full suspension bike, I highly recommend that you make sure your suspension is set up correct for your weight and your riding style. If you don't, your bike just isn't going to ride right. And it's just kind of silly to have a really expensive bike like this one and not have it ride right. So with that being said, hope this helped you. Thanks for watching.